D'acord, doncs comencem. Good morning for our morning meeting. Boda, Martin da. I can't say anything else.
Yes, I'm still impressed.
Good. So we're lucky to have these 4 researchers from the United Kingdom. Ailsa Henderson, Professor of Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. Richard Wyn-Jones, Professor of Political Science and Director of Cardiff University's Wales Governance Centre and Dean of Public Affairs. You both published recently a book, Englishness, the Political Force Transforming Britain, that I'm happy to say that we had something to do with it, because they came here for discussing and preparing the book at the Institute some time ago, so we're happy to have contributed in a way to this book. Also, we have here Daniel Wincott, Professor of Law and Politics at the School of Law and Politics in Cardiff University, and Charlie Jeffrey, Professor of Political Sciences, but currently Vice-Chancellor and President at the University of York. All 4 of them experts on territorial politics, comparative politics, so we're lucky that they're here and they will present us this terrific talk about Brexit and the Union, all the tensions and challenges derived from the problem of Brexit, Northern Ireland borders, the impact in Scotland, which had voted to remain. So here there are. The floor is yours, so you have to press that one.
Bon dia. Thank you so much for coming along. It's such a pleasure to be back here in Catalonia. And thank you in particular, Mariah, and all the colleagues here at the Centre for making us so welcome. We've done a lot of work about thinking about the UK in this building. So in terms of how we're going to proceed, we're focusing, as the title suggests, on Brexit and the Union, and my supposition, my guess is that for many of you here, the 2 political events that have defined the UK over the last decade are the independence referendum in Scotland in 2014 and then the Brexit referendum in 2016. We're going to focus on the latter, maybe as a way of coming around back to the first, if that makes sense. And the way that we're going to do it is that Ailsa is going to present some data, and then I will say a couple of things, and then my colleagues will jump in. There'll be an opportunity for you to engage, and maybe we can have a conversation about these issues. So hopefully it's all going to be, once we've got the data, hopefully it's all going to be quite informal, and there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to either make comments or ask questions. So hopefully that's okay, and I will hand over to Ailsa.
Wonderful, thanks. Thanks very much. I have to say, this is by far the nicest room in which I have ever given a presentation. And that includes the fact that one time I was asked to a conference that took place in the hall where I had my wedding reception. This is so much nicer. Right, okay, don't tell my husband I said that. So it's well known that the results of the Brexit referendum in 2016 were close across the UK as a whole, but it's also well known that there was significant territorial variation in support for leave. So we had majorities for leave in England and Wales, but not so in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. And you can also look at London as a distinct part of England as well. So it was close, there was territorial differentiation in the vote. But I think the Brexit referendum and the way that the UK government managed the Brexit process after the referendum also revealed existing divisions and tensions within the UK as a union. The first of these is about the fracturing of national identity, the way that national identity operates differently in different parts of the state, and particularly related to that, the fracturing of Britishness, and increased awareness of just how ambivalent many in the electorates are about the Union as a union of 4 territories within the UK. And Brexit has also created, in response, or reactivated other aspects, a pursuit of what we would describe as muscular unionism, but also rising support for independence. So today what I'll do is I'll show you some of the data that we have about that, and where we think it might be prompting challenges for the state. And I have to say, most of the data that we're going to talk about is data that we've collected from the State of the Union survey, and the State of the Union survey has its origins in discussions that we had in this building. So it's particularly nice to be back talking about it. Right. So in terms of the Brexit referendum, one thing that, when people try to understand who voted the way they did, a lot of the explanations suggest that there were economic reasons. People voted the way they did because they were opposed to immigration, that certain people felt left behind by globalization. And we have argued that those explanations are not necessarily wrong, but incomplete. And they're incomplete in part because they ignore the role of national identity. So when people want to talk about Leave support and they describe certain conditions or they describe certain packages of attitudes, they often ignore the fact that people in those kinds of areas with those kinds of attitudes didn't vote Leave in Scotland. So Scotland is somehow treated as something separate and not really part of the wider explanation. And so in a piece in Regional Studies, the 4 of us and others argued that to really understand the territorial variation in the vote, you have to look at national identity. And so what we have here are 3 graphs looking at the role of national identity on Leave support. And we've measured strength of British identity, but also strength of English identity, Scottish identity, and Welsh identity. These data are from the British election study. The British election study doesn't include Northern Ireland. That's why it's not on this slide. So if we look at these figures, as we move, the x-axis there, the horizontal axis is regional territorial identity. It's the sub-state identity minus the British identity. So as you move to the right of each graph, you get to the English end, the Scottish end, the Welsh end. And on the left side of the graph is the people who would prioritize their British identity, but not a sub-state identity. And one thing we can see very clearly is that territorial identities work in different ways in different parts of the state. So the more English you felt, the more likely you were to vote Leave. But the opposite is true in Scotland, where the more Scottish you felt, the more likely you were to vote Remain. And also in Wales, once we control for a host of other factors, the more you prioritized your Welsh identity, the more likely you were to vote Remain. So sub-state identities are aligning with not just different but opposite preferences in different parts of the state. And the corollary of that is that British identity is also working in different ways in different parts of the state. So British identifiers in England were Remain supporters, but British identifiers in Scotland and Wales were Leave supporters. So that's one thing that we've tried to do so that we can understand a little bit about what's going on, what was going on in the referendum. If we look past the referendum, if we move on from the vote itself, it was noted at the time that Brexit might cause tensions in the Union, if only for the very simple fact that 2 of the 4 parts did not want Brexit, but also because of the fact that leaving the European Union would require possible changes to the way the Union operates. And we wanted to know how committed people were to Brexit or to the Union, and so we asked them whether certain aspects of the constitutional status quo were worth risking in order to achieve Brexit. And included in here, I've got on the left side of this notion that, well, there might be a second referendum in which a majority of Scots vote yes. So are you willing to risk independence, Scottish independence, in order to get Brexit? And then a question about Irish reunification. in order to achieve Brexit. In the past, we've also asked about disrupting the peace in Northern Ireland, having an impact on support, losing faith in the Union, the prospect of a border in the Irish Sea. But I think these are particularly helpful. Now, we used to ask just two questions. We used to give two options, just is it worth it or is it not worth it? But that ignores the fact that some people want Scottish independence, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with Brexit. Some people want Irish reunification. So we changed the question to allow for three response options. I want it, I don't want it, but it's a price worth paying in order to achieve Brexit, and I don't want it, and it's not worth it. And if we're looking across here, what we can see is that there is clear majority support in England, in Scotland, and in Wales for the prospect of Scottish independence. The balances are different. In Scotland, you're more likely to find people who outright say, I want independence, and you have fewer people who say it's worth it. In England, fewer people who say, I want independence for Scotland, and more of them, they're more likely to say, well, it's worth it. But if you add together those who want it and those who think it's a price worth paying, you're over the majority in each of the three electorates we're looking at. And the same is true for Irish reunification. And if anything, support for a constitutional change involving Ireland is almost always higher than support for constitutional change involving Scotland. Now, these are striking figures, in part because of the size, the proportion of people who are willing to see radical change. But also, that's striking if you remember that it is the entirety of the electorate. So it also includes Remainers. So we've looked also what happens in England if you split that between Leave voters, who are on the left, and Remain voters, who are on the right. And what we see in each case is that far more Leave voters are willing to say, in fact, we're over 80% now of Leave voters saying, yes, I'm happy with Scottish independence, I'm happy with Irish reunification, if it means that I can achieve Brexit, which suggests a certain level of ambivalence about the union. It's conditional on people getting what they want in other domains, or another way to put it is that the domestic union is seen as something that can be sacrificed in order to achieve the outcome people want on the external union. Now, this notion of ambivalence interested us. And so we've devised a series of questions to probe the extent of ambivalent unionism throughout the state. This is one of them. The question has three response options, and it just asks which view is closest to your own. I want independence from my part of the UK. I don't want independence from my part of the UK, and it's a priority for me that the union remains as it is. Response option wording that was suggested by Dan here. And I don't want independence from my part, but if one or more other parts of the UK go their own way, then so be it. And that so be it option is the one that we're referring to as these ambivalent unionists. And the light green on this graph here are the ambivalent unionists, and the dark green are those who support independence. Now, what's particularly striking is that you're up around 60%, you're over 50% and up around 60% in England and Scotland when you compare those who want independence and the ambivalent unionists. The balances are different. Obviously, there's more independent supporters in Scotland and fewer ambivalent unionists, and the reverse is true in England, a fairly even balance in the case of Wales and Northern Ireland. Now, what impact has this had, this sense of ambivalence about the constitutional status quo? Well, one reaction has been a form of what we would describe as muscular unionism advocated by the UK government, by the Conservative parties, particularly in Scotland and Wales, and might seem a form of unionism more familiar to observers of unionism in Northern Ireland. We've developed a series of questions about this, and this is just one of them. And the original question asks, well, how many nations are there in the United Kingdom? Is there only one nation, a British nation? Are there only nations that exist below the level of the states, and nations just in Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland? Or do we have a situation where we have multiple nations existing within the state? There's both a British nation and Scottish nation. The survey question is a more pithy version of that. And this table here is just looking at the proportion of people saying there's only one nation, the British nation. And it's looking at proportions in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So we've broken it down by territory, but we've also broken it down by the party that people support in UK general elections. And there's two things worth noting. First, we can see variation within regions. So we can see, if we're looking at England, we can see that the views of the Conservatives and the views of the Liberal Democrats, for example, are fairly far apart on this. 28% of Conservative voters in England believe there's only one British nation. In Lib Dems, the figure is far smaller. Those two figures are not as far apart, however, as what we see in Scotland, where we have 48% of Conservatives believing there's only one nation, the British nation, and only 5% of SNP supporters. That there's even 5 is slightly curious for SNP supporters. So that gap between nationalists and unionists is the largest that we see in our data set. But it's also the case that we see variation within parties. Now, I've lumped together the Northern Ireland parties, perhaps imperfectly, with the ones operating in Great Britain. So we can look, for example, under the Labour column, we can look at the proportions in Scotland and in Wales, and we see there's a significant gap there. There's a 10-point gap between the kind of more unionist end on the Scottish Labour Party and the slightly less so for the Welsh Labour Party. But the other striking difference, I think, is if you look at the Conservative figures for Scotland and Wales, those figures are almost half of voters of the Scottish Conservative Party or the Welsh Conservative Party don't believe that there is a Scottish nation or a Welsh nation. That figure is higher than the figure that we get for the DUP, but also markedly different from the one we have for English Conservatives, who have a much more pluralist vision of the state. So the general message is one of a flight from viewing the UK as a multinational state, that this is accompanied by an increased polarization on views of the Union, particularly so in Scotland, but that also we could see problems for the party in government whose supporters have such wildly different views of the state. Now, because we're here, I thought you might like to see a little bit more about some other questions that we ask about muscular unionism. We asked questions about attitudes to British values, about possible problems with the union, whether government should listen more if people say there are problems, or whether they should spend more of their time explaining its benefits, whether governments should allow referendums, whether they should spend money to highlight union benefits or base them on need. And you can put all of these together in a muscular unionism index, and that's the figure that I have on the slide here. We've plotted the 4 electorates, they're the different colors, but we've also plotted them by party support. If you plot the 4 electorates, that top cluster there, they're all quite tightly clustered together, and that's slightly opposed to muscular unionism. But if you disaggregate them and you start to look at the Conservatives, for example, you can see considerable support for muscular unionism in the Conservative parties in Scotland and in Wales, and the DUP and UUP in Northern Ireland. But the other thing I think is helpful is if you look at the coloured dots, just look at the red dots and then look at the blue dots, and you can see it doesn't really matter which party you support in England. Your views on muscular unionism are largely the same. But if you're looking at party politics in Wales or in Northern Ireland or in Scotland, you see considerable variation in terms of people's appetite for being strong about the state. So it's not just the case that we see territorial differentiation in attitudes to the union and the fact that in Scotland people are generally less supportive, but also within single parties in different parts of the state we're seeing considerable variations in attitudes. So one reaction to this ambivalence has been muscular unionism. Another reaction has been rising support for independence for different parts of the UK, particularly so in Scotland. And it's typical to ask Scottish voters how they feel about independence for Scotland, but less common is to ask people how they feel about independence for other parts of the state. So that's what we've done here. This figure has data on support for independence for the different parts of the state. So those are the horizontal lines that say England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We're asking about independence for England, independence for Scotland. In the case of Northern Ireland, it's not independence, but reunification with Ireland. And the dots are how the electorates in those places feel about independence. The first thing to note, I would say, is that a lot of the dots are clustered fairly close to the midpoint. This is not, in the main, a series of electorates who are wildly supportive of the state as it is. The result, to me, seems more like a meh. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we can see the electorates in England, Scotland, and Wales are, on balance, quite supportive of Northern Ireland reunifying with Ireland, even if the Northern Irish electorate is not. One possible interpretation of this is that if there is a part of the UK to go, the electorates outside Northern Ireland are fairly ambivalent about Northern Ireland's place in the Union. It is seen as an expendable part. On Scotland, on Scottish independence, the average score for Scottish voters is clearly on the supportive side of the equation. And so, taken as a whole, what we can see is evidence of ambivalence, but also evidence of an appetite for change. Now, if there is an appetite for change, how likely is it that we might see it? Well, for that, my last slide before I return to Richard, is the question about referendums. So as part of our battery, we asked whether whether the UK government should allow referendums if different parts of the state, whenever a particular region or nation wants them, or the UK government should not allow referendums that threaten to break up the state. The darker bars, the green part is supportive of allowing a referendum, and the yellow parts are people who say, no, it's not a good idea to risk breaking up the state. In Northern Ireland, where there is the prospect of a border poll referendum, if the Secretary of State believes one is needed, we see strong support for holding a referendum. In Scotland, where the Supreme Court has ruled that the Scottish government cannot unilaterally call one, we see even greater support for holding a referendum. But it is also the case that in England and in Wales, over a third are very supportive, and around half are not obviously opposed to the holding of referendums within the state. So where is opposition highest? Opposition is highest in those places where support is also highest. So opposition is highest in Scotland and highest in Northern Ireland, which speaks to the extent of polarization within those parts of the state where demand for constitutional change is highest. So polarization, ambivalence, and a muscular unionist response from the government are three of the ways in which we have seen Brexit have an impact on the Union.
Great, thank you, Ailsa. So just concluding thoughts in terms of where all of this leaves us and where we might be heading. One of the things that, as an expert on Welsh politics, we're used to being seen as slightly less interesting than Scotland, I guess. And one of the things which has been quite fun over the last few years is that there's been the development of a Welsh independence movement, which has been which is a very interesting phenomenon, and it's now pretty standard for my Labour Party supporting students. So ostensibly a unionist party, to support independence or to support such far-reaching constitutional change that it's equivalent to. And lots of international journalists will now kind of come to Wales looking for an independence movement and interviewing people like me. And so there's a tendency to focus on the impact of Brexit and what's happened around Brexit on support for independence. But I think I'd like to finish by focusing on what all of this means for autonomy, what all of this means for the devolution process. So what you call autonomy, what we call devolution. And I think one of the things about what's happened since 2016 and what's happened as a result of Brexit and the way that the UK government or successive UK governments have interpreted the Brexit mandate, the mandate of the 2016 referendum result, is I think it's destabilised the basis on which autonomy was granted to Scotland and Wales in particular. Northern Ireland is always slightly different because of the peace process. But I think it's undermined the basis on which autonomy happened in the late 1990s. Why do I say that? Well, you could argue that devolution, autonomy for Scotland and Wales, was based on what you might call kind of constructive ambiguity, constitutionally speaking. The UK government retained, and the UK state retained, the idea that Parliament was sovereign. That whole kind of, that central dogma of the UK state. And if you read the devolution legislation, right at the start, there's a kind of boilerplate phrase saying, whatever happens in the rest of this legislation, Parliament will remain, the UK Parliament remains sovereign. So you watch it, guys, you know. On the other hand, there has been, at the devolved end of the kind of relationship, a sense that actually this autonomy is not, it's permanent. This autonomy is not going to be taken away. It's based on an exercise of popular sovereignty. It's based on referendum votes in Scotland and Wales. So that, yes, you can say that parliamentary sovereignty is still there, red in tooth and claw. However, somehow we know better. And we think that the state is evolving somewhere. So there was an assumption until 2016 in Scotland and Wales, and some evidence of this in the way that the Supreme Court was behaving, that that the UK was moving away from the kind of traditional notion of parliamentary sovereignty to something else. We didn't quite know what something else meant, but there was a kind of ambiguity there. What's happened since 2016 is, I think, that the UK government has undermined the basis of that constructive ambiguity, because it's actually restated parliamentary sovereignty in a pretty crude way. So we've seen pieces of legislation which undermine devolved powers. We've seen something called the Sewell Convention, which was meant to have been placed on the statute book, which basically said the UK Parliament cannot remove powers from the devolved level without their agreement. That has been overridden. And so we now have this situation where devolutionists, such as the Welsh Labour government in Wales, so they're unionists, but they believe in autonomy, they are saying, and our First Minister in Wales, Mark Drakeford, says this very, very explicitly, the union is broken. We need a new settlement. And so what devolutionists are now looking at is what they call entrenchment, constitutional entrenchment, some way of ensuring that the central state level does not exercise parliamentary sovereignty to undermine devolved powers. And that raises all kinds of big questions. So the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, the UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown, his commission has recently published a report for the Labour Party suggesting a route towards constitutional entrenchment, which we can bore you about later if anybody's interested. But there are real practical problems with doing that. How do you entrench and retain parliamentary sovereignty? In fact, doesn't entrenchment mean getting rid of parliamentary sovereignty? But devolutionists are basically saying this kind of ambiguity that we've had is no longer acceptable, because the UK government cannot be trusted, because look at what they've done. But devolutionists have got no obvious way forward. They've got no obvious route towards changing anything. So I think that what all of this might mean, and I'm not sure if any of my colleagues agree with this, okay? So they will tell you if I'm wrong, but I think what this may mean is that we've entered a period of what I've called a kind of toxic stasis, where nothing can move, okay? So people are unhappy with the status quo, but you can't move beyond the status quo. So on the one hand, there is a group of people who almost all supported Brexit, who would like to see devolution, autonomy being undermined or even completely removed. And in the Conservative Party in Wales, they are very obvious and very prominent, and these days increasingly vocal. But that, you know, the idea that you can unwind autonomy is very difficult, because public attitudes in Scotland and in Wales simply would not allow that, and there would be massive civil disobedience. And I just don't see a viable route to undermining or certainly abolishing autonomy. But on the other hand, it's not clear how you can move things forward towards entrenchment, let alone independence, because you've got a UK government saying obviously no to a referendum. It's not obvious that, for example, if we get a Labour government elected in the next, some point in the next 18 months or so, it's not clear that they would expend any political capital at all on entrenching devolution, even if you could work out a scheme for entrenching devolution. So it looks to me is that where we've ended up is that Brexit has blown up the basis on which autonomy was achieved, but it's not clear where you can go next. And my colleagues may massively disagree with this, but that's my take on it. Okay, so I don't know at this point if Charlie or Dan would like to say anything, but I will hand over to you, Maria.
Can I make a reflection which stands back from all of this a little bit, and perhaps it has something to do with toxic stasis, and that is that the two referendums we've had in Scotland and then UK-wide on Brexit were in some senses big surprises for many. A surprise that Scotland could have voted so close, 45% to demanding independence, and a surprise that the UK as a whole voted to leave the European Union. One of the things that I think we as a group have been reflecting on for years and have been talking about very explicitly in our current visit is why that was so much of a surprise. And we think that our profession, political science, bears some of the blame. In that, the dominant traditions of British political science, very much influenced after the Second World War by ideas imported from the US, were about a national or a nationalised political system in which electoral cleavages, which operated across the whole of the state, excepting Northern Ireland, which is always too difficult to bring into any model, worked in much the same way in Scotland, Wales, and England. And later on, when we started talking about values as cleavages, you could say much the same. They operate the same everywhere. Well, that may, to an extent, have been true, but the focus on those nationalising forces led us, as a profession, to be blind to some of the other things that were happening, and in particular, blind to territorial identity, sub-state territorial identity, which in the sub-states, and I include England in that, became much more important, but was never really recognised by political science analysis until people like us came along and started challenging that tradition. So that the wider context for understanding the dynamics of politics in the UK, to which political science contributes in all sorts of diffuse ways, was kind of underprepared for what happened. So I think we're saying if the political system has been surprised in the last 10 years or so, our profession is one of the explanations. Our profession has been at fault.
I kind of wish I'd gone before Charlie, because that would have been a nice place immediately to kick off the discussion. I just want to say something very briefly following on from where Richard ended, which is to reassure him that I agree with him. I agree with him quite strongly, but also just to note that this toxic stasis isn't simply a matter of constitutional politics. It also fundamentally hampers the effective delivery of public policy across a whole range of domains. London-based civil servants in the UK used to reach for an aphorism, a saying, to try and make sense of how they dealt with devolution. They used to talk about something they called devolve and forget, so that you would devolve powers to Scotland and Wales, and then you just didn't have to think about them. They'd be carried on autonomously in a way that had no implications at all for the centre. And this new muscular unionism involves the UK centre becoming involved in a myriad, a host of different micro ways in the delivery of specific packages of funding in domains that we would normally have thought of as devolved policy fields. So what you have is the UK Treasury, funding literacy and numeracy campaigns in South Wales that would normally be the responsibility of the Welsh Government, and the policy agendas are just in conflict with one another. So I'm tempted by the idea that we've gone from a kind of devolve and forget to a mindset of re-centralizing and meddling without a kind of sense of what the purpose of the UK central state in governing the territory of the state as a whole is aiming to do. So it's a constitutional stalemate, but it's also profoundly dysfunctional for the effective running of public policy across the UK.
Thank you. I'm sure that we will have questions, some people in the audience ready. Yes.
Thanks everyone for the presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I have not read the book. I will. So 2 comments. The first one is that from the presentation it's not clear how do you distinguish between Englishness, Britishness, English nationalism and unionism. So there's a bit of a confusion from the point of view of me coming to the presentation. And at some point I think you're talking about Englishness when, for example, you showed that figure about whether you want your region to be independent. But when you talk about whether the reunification of Ireland is worth it in order to get Brexit, perhaps that's, I don't know, Britishness or something else. I'm not sure. So there are all these terms, which I'm sure are well defined in the book. That's why I will read it. But there was some confusion on my part, at least. But the real question is, I think the distinction between muscular and ambivalent unionism is great. I like it. And I would like to steal it and use it for my work. So can you please tell me how you distinguish between muscular and ambivalent unionism? How do you know when a person is this or the other? Because there are other ways of doing it, for example, depending on who they vote. But then it's not a predefined concept that then you apply to individuals, depending on vote. Or perhaps it's an issue of the results you get from the survey. You get a certain number of voters and you say, I'm going to distinguish between moderates and radicals. But that's of no use to me because I want to steal the concept. So how do you distinguish these individuals when you see them at first? How can we use this for the context, right? Sorry, and I have one more question and then I'll stop. What is the relationship between these 2 types of unionism and pro-independence voters? Like, what do they generate? Do they generate, again, a stronger reaction from independent supporters when you have muscular unionism? Is ambivalent unionism more effective from the point of view of the union, and so on and so forth? So.
Should we take more? And then
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, Berta.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. I had two questions related to two groups that for me are kind of like, I still kind of have a big question. The first one is, and I'm really glad that Richard said about how Welsh usually ignore. I live in England for 4 years, and my impression is that actually English people are quite self-absorbed. So one of the things that fascinated me the most is how little you talk about anything that happens. In England, they talk about anything that happens in Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. Like, I literally left England without knowing anything about Northern Ireland, which for me was kind of weird. But I wanted to know about how Welsh identity, like what's the project of those that have a Welsh identity? Because looking at the data, it seems like Wales and Northern Ireland are maybe the places where there's a stronger sense of like the union must remain somehow. And so I wanted to know, like, how's the debate being structured in terms of like, for those that want the union to remain, like what's exactly that they perceive? And then the other group that I really can get my head around how the project works is those that feel only English and not British. And I wanted to know what's your impression about the extent to which this Englishness can be brought up to believe in the union if something happens, or if they're just gonna be just English and the union will have to just work for them, which is kind of weird because they are majority. So if it has to work with them, it kind of implies that the union is not gonna work. So I wonder if you could expand on those two things.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to ask two questions, one to our last speaker. It's the extent to which the stasis, toxic stasis, which was described initially, has practical effects. To me, it seems, although the solutions might not be that easy, the specific case you quoted, the case of delivering educational initiatives in South Wales from London, can be solved theoretically by more clearly delimited lines. And I'd be interested in more examples of where practical effects of this stasis you think will be coming. And secondly, more general, given the current, always existing metropolitan elite ruling the United Kingdom, my opinion, and given the extent to which that is now multiracial, as for instance in the case of the recent elections in the Conservative Party, where several of the leading candidates, including Mr. Sunak, the present Prime Minister, are not historically, ethnically British. To what extent are these problems frankly known? The problems, the issues of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland always being 5 removes, in my opinion, at least, from the GB position in general. But to what extent do the metropolitan elites, as I describe them, including, I would say, Sir Keir Starmer's potential cabinet, to what extent do these people know and live these problems? Obviously, they study them in the sense that they're presented to them by their experts, but have they much, if any, notion of what's going on in the peripheries?
Shall we try these 3 questions and then we go for a second round?
Can I say? So just, I mean, there's so much stuff here, and it's very rich, and maybe if I say some things and others sweep up and possibly disagree. So I'd say 3 things. Obviously, 4 things. First is read the book, obviously. And in that context, and this goes to 2 of the questions, one of the key arguments that we make around Englishness and English nationalism is that they should not be seen as a rejection of Britishness. Okay, and that's really, really important. So one of the things which makes English nationalism different from contemporary Welsh nationalism, contemporary Irish nationalism, contemporary Scottish nationalism. In their modern guise, Welsh, Irish and Scottish nationalism reject Britishness. It's not always the case. We can have a nice conversation about 19th century nationalism in all of those places. Maybe we can do it later, but they weren't a rejection of Britishness necessarily. They are now. And the danger is that people think that when we use the term English nationalism, we're saying that it's like Welsh or Scottish or Irish nationalism. No. In fact, what we see is that people who are strongly English tend to be, have a very, very, very strong allegiance to a particular version of Britain's past, present and potential future. And that's a kind of key thing in all of this. And so that's one point. Second point is on Welsh politics. Fantastic. A question on Welsh politics, thank you. What I would say as a very, very quick thumbnail sketch is that there's a very real danger that people see or try to understand Welsh politics through the prism of Scottish politics, okay? So, and because Scottish politics is so much better known. So the key cleavage in Scotland is now clearly between independent supporters and unionists. In Wales, the key cleavage is between the Conservative Party on one hand and Labour and Plaid Cymru on the other. So Labour supporters and Plaid Cymru supporters are very, very similar in terms of values, in terms even on constitutional attitudes. They're very, very similar place. Conservatives are in a completely different place. So, yeah, and they cooperate, those two parties cooperate very easily at the devolved level. And actually what we've seen is that the Labour Party in Wales, especially the Labour Party as represented in the Welsh government, because there are distinctions, they are strongly autonomous, they are strongly in favour of the transformation of the UK in a way that is fundamental and respects autonomy. Now that is something that Keir Starmer obviously would have real problems with. So Labour, and obviously in Wales, the Conservatives last won a UK general election in Wales in the 1850s. Okay, so the Conservatives have been, democracy was bad news for the Conservative Party in Wales, in a way that's not true historically for Scotland, and certainly not the case in England. So and then in terms of this really interesting question about elites, just a quick observation about that is the central state really struggles to understand what's happening at the periphery. You spoke about experts, you know, who are the experts in the central state on what's going on in the periphery? There's been one of the interesting characteristics of what's happened in the UK since the late 1990s is you've had, in some ways, quite revolutionary change around the periphery. New political institutions, a new political class developing, new policy debates. The central state hasn't really changed at all in order to catch up with that. So they really struggle in terms of understanding what's happening in the so-called periphery. And the elites, I mean, and also the people who kind of, because obviously England particularly is hugely class permeated, shall we say, and the governing elite has very few contacts with what's happening around the periphery, and that's increasingly the case. Yeah, it's increasingly the case, I think. And so I think there's a real kind of tension there in terms of the relationship between the state and the periphery, and that's manifested in all kinds of ways, which we don't really have time to go into. Sorry, Ailsa, that will have given you some time to...
On the conceptual clarity, so by Englishness and Britishness, we're using that as a shorthand for national identity. So we're just talking about identifiers there, and how those who prioritize one or the other identity feel about different things. In terms of nationalism, I don't think I was talking about that at all. But one instance of it would be in support for constitutional change, particularly support for independence. So that would be relevant to that part. In terms of the different forms of unionism, ambivalence and muscular unionism, we introduced the concept of ambivalent unionism in an article in Comparative European Politics. But if I had to distinguish between them, I would say ambivalent unionism is about commitment to the union, right? It's, you want the union to continue, but not necessarily the union as it is, and also your commitment to it is sometimes conditional on other things. So that's what distinguishes the ambivalent unionism. In terms of the muscular unionism, that's about how to save the union, how to shore up the union, and it's got various dimensions. The three most important would be a kind of mononational understanding of the state. So with this flight from multinationalism, as a way to understand the UK, doubling down on parliamentary sovereignty, and also a particular understanding of constitutional change. So opposition to constitutional change in one form, but if there is to be support for constitutional change, it is in the direction of viewing the devolution settlement as more porous than had previously been the case. And that's why we're getting, what Dan was talking about, greater intervention in I mean, some might say that's just the UK Parliament exercising the parliamentary sovereignty that is recognised in the devolution settlement, and so therefore it is itself a reflection of support for devolution. Other people would say it's just interfering in devolved areas of competence. In terms of the relationship between ambivalent unionism and support for constitutional change, yes, there is a relationship. The ambivalent unionists are less oppositional to independence in their own part and in other parts, and that's outlined in that CEP article. We've also just written a report kind of bringing these notions together, and in that article we talk through some of the challenges facing the state. We look at national identity, we look at economic solidarity and social solidarity, and we haven't really talked about that, but in general, there is support for economic solidarity and practice, but once you start specifically mentioning different parts of the state with whom you might share, support drops markedly, and yet there is this continued strong support for social solidarity within the state, although we argue amongst ourselves about the metric because of how we measure that. But the one thing that I think is particularly striking is when we look at national identity in the UK, in no part of the UK, if you force people to choose one single identity that describes them best, in no part is there a clear majority for British identity. So Scots are far more likely to choose a Scottish identity than a British one. That gap, Welsh first, then British, is slightly smaller, but the pattern remains the same. And in England, it's a dead heat between those who, if forced, would choose a British identity or an English one. So in mainland Britain, in no part is there majority support for a British identity. And that's a real challenge if you combine that with the fact that we know that British identity aligns with different values and aligns with different voting preferences in different parts of the state. It's very hard to use it as a kind of animating concept around which everyone can get behind and save the state. If it means not just different things, but like nuanced different things, but polar opposite things in different parts of the state. Dan, I think that you...
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I mean, I'd reinforce what Richard has said about whether folk at the centre understand what's going on at the periphery. I think basically they don't. The kind of dramatic example over recent years was when Karen Brady was made Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and said that she hadn't realised that people with a Catholic background didn't vote for unionist parties and people with a Protestant background didn't vote for Sinn Féin. I mean, taking up the office of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, it is pretty baffling. I think there's a party political electoral dynamic there. Sorry. I think there's a party political electoral dynamic there as well. So when the SNP dominates MPs going from Scotland into Westminster, when The DUP dominates the MPs that attend from Northern Ireland, and the SDLP has lost out to an abstentionist Sinn Féin, and then over a period of Conservative dominance, relatively few Conservative MPs from Wales at Westminster, and Richard will probably be better able to talk about the division or the difference within Welsh Labour between the MPs at Westminster and the devolutionists in the periphery. So it basically means that you've got very few people from those territories who are speaking to the party in government in any sustained way. So, you know, the Conservatives take their lead on Northern Ireland from the DUP, and that kind of illustrates the problem. On your specific question, I mean, in principle, of course, you could have a very clear delineation of responsibilities. What's happened in practice is exactly a walking away from what was, in any event, a somewhat blurred arrangement in principle that had kind of become clarified in practice, and you know, that's now being eroded. So devolution, until relatively recently in the UK, was largely about this devolve and forget idea is largely about a pattern of kind of self-rule autonomous powers with you know, things like the original financial basis for devolution, essentially trying to minimize the extent to which the centre had to worry about what the periphery did with the money. Richard talked about the trashing of the Sewell Convention. The functioning of the Sewell Convention had been very effective through the first period of devolution, and essentially what it meant was when Westminster wanted to pass legislation that encroached on devolved competences, it requested permission of the Scottish Parliament or then the Welsh Parliament to do so, and that was usually given. And the trashing of the Sewell Convention removes that. So there was an attempt to strengthen that mechanism, and then it's been trashed. So it's a kind of ending of self-restraint at the centre, in effect. And it goes beyond that because the UK Internal Market Act goes even beyond the in-principle idea that the Westminster Parliament is sovereign to, in a protected enactment of the Westminster Parliament, to giving the UK government explicit powers to intervene in a host of areas that would normally be understood to be devolved. So this is giving the UK government spending powers exactly to meddle. And it comes from a kind of resentment at the centre that they didn't get credit for things where they did effectively cooperate with the devolved level. So various kinds of city deals and so on were not generating kind of grateful support in the periphery for the centre. And that's led to a kind of bizarre use of kind of very big font to identify things on buildings as UK government presences in Edinburgh or Glasgow or Cardiff or what have you. And then there's another dynamic in here, which is essentially a legal constitutional dynamic, which has quite an ironic little story attached to it. So effectively, the Supreme Court, on several occasions, was asked to decide on whether the UK government could do things without permission of the UK Parliament in the Brexit process, and it grasped Dyson parliamentary sovereignty as its shield to say, no, the government can't do things on its own. Dyson sovereignty is the underlying principle. It's unqualified by devolution, which is this boilerplate thing in all the devolution legislation. Parliamentary sovereignty is not compromised. The Supreme Court then says this is unqualified parliamentary sovereignty, and then through a variety of processes, which also included a change in the people who are at the most senior level in the court, from a relatively kind of liberal Baroness Hale to a more traditional Lord Reid, President of the Supreme Court. Unqualified parliamentary sovereignty turns into a mechanism for preventing the devolved legislatures doing things which might in principle encroach on the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament. So it kind of reverses the sense of kind of protecting the devolved legislatures from an in principle supreme Westminster Parliament to actually protecting the supreme Westminster Parliament from potential encroachment by the devolved legislatures. And this notion of unqualified parliamentary sovereignty, which is a kind of invented concept, you don't actually find it in Dicey. He talks about absolute sovereignty. They didn't use the Diceian term. They have picked up this other term, which I think has then kind of developed and evolved. So you've got the political dynamic, but you've also got the devolved institutions now lacking, as it were, the kind of what appeared to be the constitutional protection that the court had been giving them prior to Brexit.
There were some more questions. I don't know. I'm not forcing you.
Thank you very much. I don't know exactly how to put the question, so I hope I will be clear enough. I think Richard more or less pointed out that before Brexit, there was an ambivalence, an ambiguity between parliamentary sovereignty and popular sovereignty. And after Brexit, it seems that there is a kind of a stress of parliamentary sovereignty, or there's that ambiguity has retrieved, but I'm not so sure about that, because if we think, for instance, about the importance of a referendum was in a way an expression of popular sovereignty, and it was also in a way or partially opposed to a traditional parliamentary sovereignty. So I think the question is really the sovereignty of who? So in a way, the ambivalence was behind this notion of parliamentary sovereignty to hide that there was a kind of the sovereignty of the British people, or the sovereignty of Britain, or of this British nation in single terms. And that's more or less. And let me put another thing that it's similar. You measure, perhaps, or I understood that you measure if you are in favor of constitutional change by measuring referendums. But cannot you be in favor of constitutional change without being in favor of referendums? So, in a way, you see this, they are both connected in some way. So thank you very much. It was very inspiring.
Oh, are we gonna, sorry.
Thank you. Quickly, thank you for your presentation. Very interesting here. First technical question, I was wondering, when was the survey conducted specifically, and have you tried to connect some of the questions to previous surveys so that you can show trends? Are there anything specific you would like to share with us on that level? And also I was wondering if you, Richard, could tell us about Gordon Brown's constitutional entrenchment proposal, because I'm not familiar with it, and I was wondering, do you think it's of any analytical value if you want to get out of this toxic stasis? Or, anyway, I'm not familiar with it, so I was wondering if you could share some thoughts with us.
I'll be very quick. I'm conscious of so the point you make about popular and parliamentary sovereignty is a very good one. So maybe I should slightly rephrase what I meant was that the pre-2016 we had the fact that the devolution settlements, they haven't been very settled, but the devolution legislation all started with a very, very clear statement: Parliament remains sovereign. But at the devolved level, that was seen as, okay, they say that. However, these bodies have been established through referendums. You know, that undergirds them. That gives them a permanence that maybe is not implied in the legislation. Okay. what happens, and there's a real paradox here, is that the 2016 exercise of popular sovereignty in the Brexit referendum then leads to an absolute kind of retrenchment and parliamentary sovereignty writ large. So that paradoxically, popular sovereignty in 2016 has given parliamentary sovereignty at the UK level turbochargers, okay? So maybe that's a better way of putting it. I mean, I take, there's a paradox there about the relationship between them. On the Brown stuff, this is quite a technical conversation, and I'm not sure how interested everybody is, but so let me just say, the Brown idea is because the Supreme Court, and what Dan has said is very helpful here, because the Supreme Court has basically decided that there's a kind of an unrestricted approach to parliamentary sovereignty. It had appeared before 2016 that the Supreme Court was developing a doctrine which was saying some bits of legislation, despite the fact that there's parliamentary sovereignty, some bits are constitutionally entrenched, in part because they're underpinned by referendums, okay? They are special. And so the UK government can't simply kind of ignore that. The UK Parliament can't simply ignore that. And what Brown wants to do, he wants to say, actually, there are constitutionally entrenched pieces of legislation, and they will be protected by a reformed second chamber. So there's the idea of reforming the House of Lords and giving them a role around protecting these pieces of entrenched legislation, and they include the devolution statutes. Now, there are all kinds of problems with this, because at the end of the day, he doesn't want to challenge parliamentary sovereignty. So I'm not sure it gets you anywhere in the end. But when you hear people talking about a reformed second chamber, at least from the Labour Party perspective, one of the ideas behind that is to entrench devolution. I don't think it works, and I don't think Labour are going to do it. But that's what it's about. That's very brief.
Just coming in briefly on this referendum, popular sovereignty, parliamentary sovereignty point, again echoing what Richard said, absolutely there's a paradox there, and through the kind of wild gyrations of Parliament after the Brexit referendum, there was definitely a kind of playing of a popular sovereignty card that said, well, elite parliamentarians couldn't override the will of the people, and you had, crush the saboteurs headlines and judges depicted as enemies of the people for insisting on parliamentary sovereignty. And yet, the slogan that motivated that referendum was take back control. And it was take back control of our monies, borders, and laws, so that we should only, in England, Britain, the UK, be governed by laws made by the Westminster Parliament. And the critical twist, which I think allows the Supreme Court now to walk away from the constitutionalization of devolution legislation, is that having left the EU, the Supreme Court no longer needs to find a way of maintaining the idea that some other body of rules needs to be effectively enforceable whatever Parliament says, i.e. EU laws. So, the trick going back to the early 70s was to try and find a way of reconciling the idea of parliamentary sovereignty with the UK's EU membership. And as the body of EU law changed and the UK's relationship to that law changed, you had this kind of technical dance that gave originally the House of Lords Appellate Committee, but then once it was created, the Supreme Court, this autonomous position in the political system, and they were able to kind of develop that around the European Convention of Human Rights to some extent, but particularly around devolution, knock out the central pillar of that, and the rest of it becomes much, much more vulnerable. So in a sense, it's exactly using popular sovereignty to return to parliamentary sovereignty as a kind of central symbol of what, you know, British political identity means, particularly in England.
Thanks very much. Just briefly on the ambiguity point, I think the view that ambiguity about parliamentary sovereignty enabled autonomy to function in some way is similar to an argument that Lindsay Patterson makes about administrative devolution in Scotland. So he argued that before we had devolution, before we had a Scottish Parliament, and we just had administrative devolution, that administrative devolution also allowed autonomy to flourish in Scotland, partly because it just meant that the UK didn't quite operate as a unitary state, but also part of the argument is that that activity was largely ignored by the rest of the state. And because it was ignored by the rest of the state, that enabled autonomy to flourish. And I think the thing about Brexit is that we have the same kind of thing, this ambiguity and people not really quite paying attention to what's going on. All of a sudden, as a result of Brexit, the spotlight is on, and then there seems to be a desire to kind of resolve that. In terms of the point about attitudes to change are not just attitudes to holding a referendum, absolutely. I think there's an important distinction between the what of constitutional change and the how of constitutional change. So in terms of the what of constitutional change, we ask questions about support for independence. We ask questions about, in this survey, but also, Richard's the head of the Welsh election study. I'm the head of the Scottish election study. In those survey vehicles, we also ask loads of questions about support for devolution max, support for the devolution of specific policy areas, what should be devolved and what should be reserved. We're working on stuff now about attitudes to constitutional entrenchment, the behavior of the centre, how the centre should adapt. I should say we have a survey going into the field in the spring, so if you have any suggestions, then please send them our way. On the survey, so the State of the Union, these are data from the 2021 State of the Union survey, and we began our work in 2010, thanks to a grant originally that Charlie had to look at attitudes in sub-state territories in the UK, France, Germany, Austria, and Spain. And when we applied to the funders, it was one of those schemes where you needed 3 funders to say yes, and then the project could go ahead. And we had 3 say yes, but the UK funder said, well, you can have your money to study Scotland, and you can have your money to study Wales, but there's nothing going on in England, so you don't need any money to study them. And we have had that problem about finding money ever since. And that answer annoyed us so much that we set about trying to construct a survey that we could use to evaluate what was happening in England. So with 1 year off, we have conducted the Future of England survey annually from 2010. The book uses the data from 2010 to 2016. From 2018 to 2021, we bolted surveys in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland around the Future of the England survey. So the Future of the England survey continues and runs along within the State of the Union survey. And we've been one of our main tasks has been to try and adapt questions to the reality that we think we're seeing, and so that we can provide some evidence base, some evidence for what people are saying is going on in the Union. And as a result, we've never really been afraid to change questions if we think that the circumstances around us have changed. However, we do retain a core of common questions all the way through. So the book has trackers running through from 2010 to 2016. So yeah.
I have a question. You made a point that Brexit is one of the factors that has, or is the factor that has blown up the settlement of devolution. To what extent is the factor that has accelerated a trend that could have been linked to the Scottish independence? Because I love your expression about devolve and forget. because it was something that we could see from other countries, and been very jealous, because we had probably devolve, I don't know exactly what devolving means, and regret. So was that regret showing the regret for losing control after all? I mean, one of the messages about Brexit is we're going to keep control of the situation. So to what extent, or maybe not, but it's the perspective from a Catalan that I'm surprised that something like Brexit is the factor, and there was nothing before that could be perceived as pulling towards blowing up the settlement of devolution, so re-centralizing basically.
Can I offer a reflection on that, which also goes back to the peripheries and metropolitan elites? And it's about your conception of periphery. It doesn't have to be far from the centre, I don't think. A periphery can be a marginalised group. And I think what we found in our work on England was that a good chunk of people in England who prioritised an English national identity felt that they were a marginalised group whose views were not heard. And those views were about a cluster of things that hung together. One, a resentment about Scotland having devolution. Connected to that, a sense of, well, how do we have a political voice in the British political system, which is an English voice. A hostility to immigration and a hostility to the European Union. Now, we talked about those findings with our metropolitan elites. We in particular tried to alert the Labour Party in London at the UK level to some changes in the electorate in England which we felt they ought to think about because it might impact on their electoral chances. We also spoke with representatives in the government at the time, which was a Conservative government. In the end, the Labour Party didn't listen to us, but I think the Conservative Party did listen to us. And it listened to us in particular after the Scottish referendum, where it quite consciously tried to mobilise resentment about Scotland to gain support in England. And that was a strategy which was successful in the 2015 general election. I remember watching the announcement of a first stage of that process of mobilising England the very morning after the Scottish referendum, and I talked about a constitutional chain reaction, where the Scottish debate had now unleashed something in England, and we weren't quite sure where that was going to go next. And it went somewhere where the Conservative Party metropolitan elite hadn't thought it would, which was to unleash a potential to lose the Brexit referendum, which was clearly not David Cameron's aim. And this is a long way round to your point. I don't think we know where that constitutional chain reaction is going to end up, because we now have a situation where clearly there are dynamics at play in the different parts of the UK, including, and still I think, in England, which our political institutions, but also the integrative apparatus of our political parties, which work Britain-wide, are not obviously capable of containing. So, goodness knows where it will end. But even though I'm not less involved these days, I think these lot will keep a close eye on things so that our metropolitan elites can continue to be informed.
There's such a lot in your question, Maria, and I'm not even going to start to try and cover all the dimensions. But I'll just mention one element, which is the way that It's important to realise that patterns of vote choice, patterns of voting behaviour make all of this stuff even more complicated. Because if I mentioned earlier that the Conservatives last won a UK general election in Wales well over a century and a half ago. The Conservatives last won the popular vote in Scotland in 1959, I think it is. Anyway, it's a long time ago. So the Conservatives are predominantly an English party, but have nonetheless entrenched and sizable minorities in Scotland and in Wales who vote for them. And it's very easy in that context where you've got a UK level which sees itself as supreme to use its ability to intervene to try and bolster its support base in Scotland and Wales. And so you're seeing, because the UK government is both the English government for many domestic purposes and the UK government, it views itself as supreme, is involved in a battle with the SNP in Scotland that runs the Scottish government at the moment, the eternal battle with the Labour Party, which runs Wales. You end up with really the way that the political dynamics and the constitutional dynamics kind of play against each other and play off each other is very, very complicated. And it means that the UK, this kind of self-restraint, which the UK government really should be constitutionally thinking about the territorial integrity of the state, they should probably be self-restrained. They completely fail, in part because they're fighting people who are political enemies all the time in Scotland and Wales. So these dynamic, all the political and the constitutional, the public policy, all of these things intersect in really complex ways, which I guess is not news to you in Catalonia, but still surprises people at the UK level when you point this out to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is right. And just, you know, the temptation, following on from what Richard said, the temptation for politicians at the centre, particularly conservative politicians, to take what you might think of as a sort of cheap shot at any given moment is, because it lands well with their core support in England, is kind of overwhelming it at any given moment, and they never quite get to the kind of longer term self-restraint. I think another aspect of that political dynamic has to do with the which came out or relates to some of the data that Ailsa talked us through, that the people with whom they talk in the periphery tend to be in quite extreme positions within peripheral politics. So they give them a reading of Welsh or Scottish or Northern Ireland politics, which is far from the mainstream. To come to your question very directly, my sense, though, is that there was a kind of elite driven set of processes at the institutional level, right up to and even to some extent after Brexit, that were still gradually extending the scope of devolved competences and in some ways the depth of devolved or autonomous power. So you have that kind of institutional process, which included, in a not very well thought out way often, but, you know, devolution of much more substantial tax powers, for example, the idea that the devolution statutes were permanent, all this sort of stuff. But that operated in a completely different way to the kind of popular and electoral kind of dynamics that Richard's talked about. So you have these things, and you know, Brexit becomes the occasion of their collision in a very dramatic kind of a way.
Yeah, you have another question.
At risk of prolonging the interesting discussion even longer, could I mention three totally disparate elements? I'm thinking of a football match about 20, 25 years ago where the Norwegian commentator commented Maggie, your boys took a hell of a beating. In the context of Brexit and the UK Parliament took a hell of a beating. The UK Parliament proved itself totally incapable for 12, 18 months of responding to the decision by the people on Brexit, and subsequently made the worst deal possible, in my opinion. Second issue, political parties. They're so unrepresentative. Nobody, in inverted commas, my opinion, belongs to political parties. Perhaps a fair number of people in this room do, but to my mind, they're not representative. And the issue in Spain and in the UK of the lack of representativity of political parties. I talked about the metropolitan elite. I think I could equally talk of the political elite, because anybody that's involved in politics is a priori, in my opinion, an elite. And finally, and most complicated of all, the current meltdown in Scotland, where the SNP has gone from there to there in a couple of months. I'd be interested in any comments, not least from our Scottish representatives. That's an awful lot. I'm in the hands of the chair, obviously.
Can I just on the one observation, which is probably completely free of evidence, and then one that is evidence. So the UK Parliament found itself completely incapable of working. I think my interpretation is that wasn't working, and it was working slowly because it was such a difficult thing. I mean, I think we got there in the end, and we got there without violence, and I think that's probably a sign that things were working as they were supposed to a certain extent. On the point about political parties, yes, I think in general you're right. However, one thing we know about Scotland in particular is that the referendum had two effects. One, it did lead to a kind of flourishing of political engagement. We had thousands of people coming onto the electoral register that had previously not been on the electoral register. The introduction of individual electoral registration immediately after the referendum then made it hard for everyone to get back on again. So it had a genuine fostering of political engagement, and then also it really kickstarted a myth about the transformative effect of the referendum on people's political engagement. And if you look at the evidence, well, how much evidence do we really have about whether the referendum had a transformative effect or not? We can look at turnout, we can look at people's sense of efficacy, for example. But one I like is the party membership statistics, and I was trying to see if I had the exact figures to hand. But before the referendum in Britain, it's something like 1 in 125 voters belongs to a political party. And in Scotland, that number was always smaller. It was around 1 in 75, I think. But after the referendum, I think we're in a case where 1 in 25 members of the electorate belongs to a political party. Now, that was almost all driven by an increase in SNP membership. And although the Greens, from a lower base, more than doubled their membership, I think they went up about four times. So you are right. Most folks don't belong to political parties, but the exception to that is post-referendum Scotland, where we have had an incredible. We have had pockets of data that suggest that there has been an effect of the referendum on people's engagement with the formal political process.
I'll just pick up on the, does Westminster work point, and although I absolutely wouldn't want to contradict what Ailsa's just said about avoiding political violence, I think that's a kind of non-trivial part of the process. It's clear that the parliamentary processes around Brexit have basically changed the Conservative Party at Westminster. in ways that have turned it into a profoundly dysfunctional party. So a very large swathe of its kind of more centrist membership has been kicked out or left. Basic levels of kind of experience and competence have dipped very sharply to the point where we could have this really peculiar, dramatic episode with Liz Truss as Prime Minister that, you know, drove the UK state very close to the edge of financial disaster. And, you know, they've kind of cobbled together a minimally competent core, but some of the major offices of state are still being run by people where you question whether they're up to the job in a pretty fundamental kind of a way.
Can I just jump in to clarify? I think there's a meaningful distinction between bad government and a functioning parliament. I think throughout we retained a functioning parliament that was working through a very difficult issue as best it could. That doesn't mean that the government was making it easy at all times. But we retained a government, which is not the case, and it's even in some of the devolved administrations. We retained a functioning executive throughout. There were no delays to money bills, for example, so the budget got sorted out. It was just this one policy area that made things very, very difficult. But it's a difficult policy area.
And the SNP is in a mess. I think that is a quote of the current president of the SNP, Mike Russell.
Okay, so I think we finished by now. Thank you, the four of you, for such an interesting, nice, and we can compare a lot with our experience. So it's useful for, I hope, for both sides. And thank you to the audience for coming and participating so much. Thank you.